All right, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's joint webinar between ACCP and AST. Today we're going to be talking about how to utilize and implement the Transplant Research and Innovation Network, also known as TRaIN, the research toolkit. We are fortunate to have some great speakers today. So we have Dr. Kristen Zemprich, who is a clinical pharmacy specialist at the University of North Carolina Medical Center, where she cares for inpatient abdominal transplant recipients and is an adjunct associate professor of clinical education through the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. Last year, she served as the chair of the ACCP TXP PRN Research Committee, the co-chair of the TRaIN committee, and the co-lead for the regulatory component of the toolkit. Currently, she serves as the lead for the data work group within the TRaIN committee, and she's also the current secretary and treasurer of the ACCP Transplant PRN. We also have Dr. Marissa Brockhoff, who is a clinical pharmacy specialist of solid organ transplant at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois. Her practice areas include the care of abdominal transplant recipients within the inpatient and ambulatory environment. She also actively participates in clinical mentorship and teaching as the director of the PGY2 solid organ transplant residency program, research, quality improvement, and national committee involvement as well. And she was heavily involved within the TRaIN research toolkit development. Unfortunately, Dr. Dave Salerno isn't here today. He wasn't able to be present, so we'll have Kristen be presenting on his behalf. And then lastly, we'll have Dr. Matt Harris, who's a solid organ transplant pharmacist at Duke University Hospital. He has a primary practice area of abdominal transplant. He also currently serves as the co-chair of the ACCP and AST Transplant Research and Innovation Network. And we'll be kind of finishing off our talk a little bit later today. So just a few housekeeping tips before we get started. So make sure that when you enter and when you're here, make sure to make your microphone remains muted until the end when we have the Q&A portion. If you have any questions during the discussion today, please submit your questions via the chat function. You can send them directly to me or the ACCP member who's joined here, and we'll go through the questions at the end of the webinar. It will be recorded and posted on the ACCP Transplant YouTube channel for future viewing. If you have any technical difficulties, first try to log off, log back in, and try refreshing your internet connection. If none of that works, then please message me and we can try to figure out what's going on. And just to kind of start off with the slides here, the speakers don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose, but I just wanted to go through kind of how to find where the toolkit is if you guys are ever interested or trying to find it and aren't sure. So once you log into, you can find it either on the AST side or the ACCP side. So if you log into the AST TX Pharm COP, you can go under communities and then select My Communities. From there, you'll find library and you can select the library portion and it'll have this drop down folder. And when you scroll down, you'll find there's a section for the Transplant Research and Innovation Network, or TRaIN. And under there's a research toolkit. And then once you click on that, the folder context of the TRaIN research toolkit will pop up so that you can download and access the toolkit. From the ACCP side, so once you're logged in through ACCP, if you go to communities, you can go to My Communities, and from there, as long as you're a member of the Transplant PRN, you should have this Transplant PRN pop up here that you can select. And from there, if you select on the library portion at the top, then you can find the different resources. And if you expand the resources, you can go under TRaIN resources. As you can see, we have a few different options for you to utilize. So there's a manuscript peer review guide that can be utilized. There's a grant how-to guide. So a lot of different great tools that are to your that you can utilize. But the one that we're going to be focusing on today is going to be the research toolkit. All right, and now that you guys kind of know where to find it, we're gonna go through it a little bit here. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you for the introduction. With all research, it first stems from an idea, whether something you've came across in practice or something you found when reviewing the literature that you want answered. And I think intuitively, we all have these questions going through our head on how we're going to proceed with making that idea into a research project. To start, we have single center or multi-center study. So I think here you really need to look at your question and the study design that would be best suited to answer it. I would also think about your population you have at your institution. Do you have the sample size to reach power for your question, or do you need to gather other centers in order to increase your sample size? Do you have a comparative group at your center, or do you need to look for one? Also, do you have the uniformity or diversity you're looking for to create this study and make it a good, solid project? So many times we think single center retrospective, but I want to encourage you to think, hey, it's a multi-center study also a good fit for this idea or this research project. Multi-center doesn't mean you have to gather 10, 15, 20 other centers. It can just mean one other center, two other centers as well. With multi-center, we'll talk a lot more about it here in a bit, but it does require more work and a little more integration and communication with your IRB and the legal team there to ensure communication between centers. For studies, whether it be prospective or retrospective, I think keeping in mind you have the time frame to do a prospective study, to consent patients, stratify them, and then wait until they reach their outcome, or do you want to go back and gather the outcomes that have already happened? So many times, especially for like residency project timeframes, we think of more retrospective studies. To apply this, the TRaIN work group is undergoing a multi-center research project. And the question or idea we had is to evaluate Valga and cyclovir dosing regimens in non-kidney transplant recipients on dialysis. So when you think about this question and you think about your own center, you may think, oh, I don't have that many patients who are on dialysis that aren't kidney transplants. I'm not going to have the sample size. So right there, you have an idea that you need to gather additional centers to get that sample size. Also, you may think about your center and how everybody at your center doses valsite the same way when patients are on dialysis. You have your own institution guideline for dosing. However, if you incorporate other centers, you're going to have a variety of different dosing, different regimens, and then you have different comparative groups. So with that, we did a multi-center design for this question, and it is retrospective for time's sake and for looking back at outcomes such as like breakthrough, CMV infection. You want to make sure you have plenty of time in order to capture those outcomes. Other research type questions you want to think about, especially if you think your study or idea is more suited for multi-center, is which center will act as a primary or coordinating center. Many times this is going to be the primary investigator because the primary coordinating center is usually the one that's going to own the data, have the rights to the data for further use, and have the main ownership of that data at the end of the project. You also want to ask yourself who will be on your team. So I would think about the strengths you have in research and maybe areas you want to seek help. So in particular, if you have not that much experience with statistical analysis, you may want to grab someone that does. Or if you're looking at antibody development and that's not your jam, then you may want to get someone from the HLA lab or someone with more expertise in that area. So really think about your strengths and maybe areas that you could benefit from for the study. How will you select your centers? So thinking about a multi-center study, let's say you have a question on kidney transplant patients. Well, you don't maybe want to ask the whole PRN to say who's involved because maybe you don't have the capacity to include 30 centers in your project. But if you're thinking about a specific question for lung transplant patients, maybe you do want to reach out to the full PRN in order to gather enough centers and enough sample size. So you can reach out to colleagues that you know have similar guidelines or maybe different approaches in order to compare your question and have two study groups. Also thinking about the time commitment, not currently in creating the proposal and going through your own IRB, but also thinking about the coordination of other centers, the time commitment you have even 6 months from now, a year from now, and making sure that multi-center study comes to completion. For estimated time frame, this is very helpful to think about ahead of time because when you're reaching out to centers to be involved, they're going to ask you, what are the deadlines? What's the time frame? Because they want to see if it's a good fit for them as well. So thinking about how much data you're having pulled, how much is manual, how many centers you're having involved, all of those things take time. So you may want to think longer term, especially if you're having a more robust, more centers involved. Moving back now to the Valk and cyclovir study and how we answered those questions. So which center will be the primary coordinating center for this? We have the Duke University Medical Center, as Matt Harris here is the primary investigator. So that makes more sense as he's leading the project. He's facilitating that with his IRB, and he's the primary coordinating center. Who will be your team? So largely this starts with whoever wrote, the study proposal, and then recruiting a statistical guru or someone really good with stats to make sure the study design and analysis is good from the start. And you can also, with multi-center studies, have an idea of how you're going to complete authorship and how you're going to complete collaborative members on your team, and the overall scope of how broad or how narrow you want that to be. How will you select other centers? So for this study, that started within the TRaIN work group and members within to make sure we have a solid process in place before broadening it out to even more centers. Do you have the time commitment? Yes, but always anticipate way more time than you think. Matt can probably speak to this as well, that it just takes a lot more time than you expect. So making sure you have the time devoted to that as well. Estimated time frame here. So initially it was a 2-year expected time frame, but I think maybe now it's going to be more like 3 years or so. And that largely can be variable depending on, again, how many centers, how long it takes for IRB approval and navigation through those processes. So additional questions to think about when pursuing a multi-center study. If you're looking through things and you're like, yes, I'm going to pursue this. I'm about have my study proposal ready to go. I just have to think about like the IRB process. One thing you may come across is language about centralized versus local IRB. So centralized IRB is when your institution's IRB manages not only your institution, but oversees other institutions' study process. This takes a lot of time, and with a lot of time, it takes money. And so that's why a lot of times these are geared only towards NIH grants or funded or sponsored studies. So most academic medical centers, these are only for NIH grants. So if you're thinking about this, definitely ask ahead of time. I know there may be a few that do require like more of a hefty fee if you're doing a centralized IRB through their institution, but again, it may not be feasible for the scope of your project. So many times you're doing your local IRB and then coordinating with each IRB at the different centers. And that also just takes more time and is a little less efficient, but less costly for your center. So for this study, we're doing the local IRB process because it's an unfunded study for the Valga and cyclovir study. Does your institution have a local office to manage all these legal paperwork, which I'll talk a little bit more later about, and making sure that you have right agreements with other institutions? Most IRBs do, but I would just make sure you have that before you proceed. And then thinking also about how you're going to share that data. So we're going to talk a little bit more about REDCap and the benefits of using REDCap for data collection and data sharing, but also thinking about what you're going to use to collect that data. So for the ValSite study, we're using REDCap for an example, and then data we can pull through UNet as well as the electronic medical record with some manual data collection as well at particular centers. So now on the flip side, let's say you have an email that's asking you to be a part of a multi-center project, and before you jump in and say, yes, I definitely want to do this, yes, I would ask yourself a few questions. Thinking about one, again, does your IRB have a legal team to manage these agreements with the other institution? Do you have the patient population they're requesting in that request? And then does your center allow for the same data sharing that's required? So thinking about, does your center allow limited data sets, or do they need purely de-identified data sets to be shared? So making sure you know what kind of data they're looking for and that you're able to meet that need. Also, a lot of times the authorship criteria will be listed in advance, and sometimes this could include that you have to collect on X number of people, be involved in different aspects of the project to be considered an author. And Marissa will go more into authorship and the criteria for that. But you want to ask yourself, is this something I want and need to pursue? And how much more do I need to do in order to meet that criteria? And then later, this may happen after you say yes and while you're submitting and getting ready to submit your own IRB, but making sure you have all the information your institution needs and that you have all that information from the coordinating center in order to complete your own internal IRB and approval. So I've talked a little bit about all the agreements that are needed between different institutions. And so there's something called a collaborative agreement and something called a data use agreement. So collaborative agreements are unfunded collaboration between an institution and another party. So thinking of one academic medical center to another, where both parties or people at one institution and the other are contributing to the performance of a research scope of work, meaning they're contributing to the various aspects of authorship. And this collaborative agreement ensures ownership of the study as a whole, making sure recognition is provided when due. And a lot of times this also will include the data use agreement. Switching gears to the data use agreement, this is an agreement between institutions to exchange data. So data use agreements are between one institution and another or a company. And basically it makes sure that you're treating that data appropriately and under the privacy laws needed. So data use agreements are very much more straightforward for the legal team to pursue, takes less time, whereas a collaborative agreement adds an extra layer and may take a little bit longer for the two coordinating centers to agree upon and then be able to pursue the project further. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Marissa.
Thank you, Kristen. I am going to expand a little bit more within authorship and the actual IRB itself. So a project or publication authorship might seem simple, and sometimes it is, especially in the case of perhaps a residency project. But the toolkit is a great review of this that can be used. When designating authorship, it's most clear in the form of an authorship agreement. You must designate and agree on all roles and responsibilities. Common components of this are discussing the requirements of authorship and generating that author list. This includes the order, and it will include the primary or principal, sometimes referred to as the first author, and the corresponding author if those people are different, as well as the senior, often referred to as the last author. It's also a good review of other details such as dates, timelines, maybe for data collection, drafts, manuscript submission. What are your goals? Possibly a discussion of potential journals of publication and who owns the data or the copyright. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, provides guidelines that discuss formal criteria that state an author should be one of or all of four things. They should have substantial contributions to the work, possibly as far as design, data collection, or analysis. They should draft the work or contribute to the intellectual content. They should have final approval of the version to be published. And lastly, they should be accountable for all aspects of the work related to accuracy and integrity. So collaborative authorship agreements and contributions. Collaborative authorship agreements are generally for larger studies and groups. As we said, they might not be required for something like an RPD team and resident project. They highlight various authorship components in the timeline, and they should include the license to the study and arrangements for future use. So what counts as a study contribution? Because this can really vary. There's three primary types of study contributions. There's substantial contribution, and this means kind of as it seems. Without that author's contribution, the project or a vital part of the project could not have been completed. This is a little different than a non-research example. This is perhaps where the author did not collect or analyze the data, but maybe did a literature collection and analysis, potentially reviewed arguments or documents and compiled the manuscript. Lastly, there's a non-authorship contribution. This could be anyone from computer programming or technical assistance, writing grants or securing funds for the project, if that's applicable, possibly just data collection alone, stats, idea development, possibly a manuscript review. These contributions can be put into an acknowledgement section. It's also important to note that if you did receive a grant or funding from an organization or monetary monies per se, you want to make sure to include that thank you and acknowledgement in that acknowledgement section as well. Here I have an authorship agreement example that is also highlighted in the research toolkit, and I've split it on to two different sections, the left and right, so that it could fit on the slide. So it is an example per se. The most important part I wanted to highlight or note was the right side of the screen, the authorship order. Orders can be done in a couple different ways. The order could be listed in order of contributions, perhaps the percent or number of patients contributed to a data set. They also could be defined in alphabetical order, which is not as commonly done, but is a possibility. Most importantly, the exact order should be discussed and decided prior to the publication and decided upon prior to proposal submission. As Kristen delved into a little bit, when looking at IRB or switching gears to IRB, everyone's favorite part of the review or part of the initial project proposal, and sometimes can be the most timely for sure. You want to take a look at whether or not your project is going to be centralized or necessitate local IRB. So as Kristen discussed a little bit, a centralized IRB is one IRB of record that's conducted on behalf of all participating sites. And then they can become the IRB of record for all sites. This is most commonly done, as Kristen mentioned, in an NIH or National Institute of Health funded study or other sponsored or funded studies. What we're dealing with most of the time is that of a local IRB. This is certainly going to be the case for a single center, potentially a resident research presentation for the year. This is single center, as I said, institutional IRB. It can also be a multi-center study with local IRBs being used. That is when each institution's IRB is responsible for the study review and approval, but then they all join together maybe with a DUA or other contract. This is what is being done, as Kristen mentioned, for the valganciclovir project, and is what we're looking at most of the time. Also, when we're discussing IRB, it's important to mention the actual type of review. These can be exempt, expedited, or potentially a full review. Exempt reviews are often the simplest. They're deemed minimal risk. The subjects cannot be identified, and this is more looking at things such as surveys, maybe internal studies such as a quality assurance or performance improvement, QAPI study used for internal use. They do still require IRB review, but the IRB committee in its full oversight is not required, so they don't sit for their monthly or periodic meeting. This is a little different than an expedited review. And this is what a lot of us are most familiar with, because this is what where a residency project would fall under. Your observational, potentially, or most likely retrospective chart review. It falls under specific regulations, but the review is not conducted through a full IRB meeting, but may be carried out with a single or multiple IRB members. So this is what most of us are most familiar with. This differs from a full review. These are not eligible for an expedited review. They're a higher level with potential risks involved. The full IRB committee must review this, and this is often reviewed annually. Here we might think of clinical trials, maybe a pilot study or something for investigational drugs, or potentially a vulnerable population, such as maybe pregnant women, children, patients that are incarcerated, whatnot. The review criteria are defined by federal regulations, and I definitely encourage you to see the toolkit for full review criteria. As always, though, it's strongly encouraged to refer to your own institution's IRB for a full description of these criteria before initiating a research proposal. So when we're thinking about IRB components, again, everyone's favorite part of the study, there's a couple different areas that we want to think of. The first one is background. This is going to be your hypothesis or purpose of the study. Next would be study design. This is going to be your objectives, your methodology, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, kind of collected variables and data sources, maybe identifiability of the data. Next usually comes your research population. This is going to be the subjects, the age, the number, how are they recruited? Are they high risk population like we talked about? For the subject identification, recruitment, or consent, this is going to be how will these patients be screened? An example of this might be, this is a retrospective study and therefore does not require consent. Direct patient care will not be involved in the study, and the data will only be based on a review of the patient's medical record or health system record. All data will be identified with accordance to HIPAA. Next, you'll need to include methods and study procedures. These might be the efficacy and safety assessments, what data will be collected, whether it be demographic data, clinical data, as well as the statistical methods. For risk assessment, this is going to be potential risks and protection against these risks, such as maybe data storage. Where are you going to be collecting and keeping this data? An example might be that there are minimal risks to the study subjects. All data would be de-identified to limit the chance of exposure of PHI. Maybe something like REDCap will be used for data collection and storage. Lastly, you're going to need to provide the qualification of the team members, which Kristen discussed it a little bit. City modules might need to be obtained by all members of the team, and any financial conflict of interest be disclosed. A question we sometimes get for team members is, on a resident research project, who should be listed as the PI of the project? Should this be the resident or should this be the preceptor? Generally, what we will do is have the preceptor as the PI for the study for the year, as that person will be maintained in the study further than a year. There'll be the ongoing correspondence, and there'll be the person of record who continues the study until it is closed. I'm going to switch things over to some data management. That will not be David. David looks a little different today. It's going to be Kristen again speaking.
Thank you. Dave unfortunately had another, or fortunately had another speaking engagement today. So he was able to put slides together and give me some tips. So I will be sharing those with you today. So first, why does some research projects just not make it to completion or to publication? And so here we have the heart failure model. And this concept was made by Elliot Tapper. So when we think about research, first we have the preload section. So your data, your design issues. So this includes bias, heterogeneity, issues already with your design of your project before you even have begun data collection. Also, if you think about database construction issues, thinking about inconsistent definitions throughout your project, already starting with the wrong statistical test or identification of the wrong testing for the type of variable you're collecting. And then we have the pump, where I think most of us may have some bad experience with, or maybe don't want to sit and collect all that data for so long. So the pump is the actual task of retrieving that data. So one thing is definitely collecting more data than you need to answer your outcome. So thinking about all the variables you're looking for, all the data you're looking for, what is really needed to answer your primary outcome, and what are appropriate secondary outcomes, and what data is just extra that's not going to have high yield, and thinking about removing that data. Also thinking about the functionality of your data collection. So whether you're using Excel or REDCap, is it functioning in the way that is most efficient, or is it very cumbersome to use and actually creating more time in completing your data collection? And then you may have heard this phrase before, but the juice is not worth the squeeze. This probably definitely comes into scanning, charts, notes, things where there are things inconsistently reported, such as maybe like rationale for discontinuation of various medications. And a lot of times these types of data are surrogates for surrogate markers of your primary outcome. So they're really going to be very low yield. So thinking about removing those, but also think about if you were to review this study, are those things that maybe the reviewer is going to ask you for? So you still want to collect it even though it's low yield. So really thinking about your data and how it's formatted to improve efficiency there. And then after load is data validation. So I think the one concern here is that all of a sudden you collected all this data and now you lost confidence that the data is collected correctly or that you have errors in the data. And now you're less confident moving forward with analysis and reporting your outcome. You also can maybe use incorrect analysis and maybe report the wrong outcome based off of the data you have. So those are some pitfalls to research, and we're going to focus a little bit more on the data section. So for data, oops, sorry, jumped ahead one extra slide. For data construction, first we need to identify the problem. So bringing back that valsite study where we have different strategies for dosing valsite prophylaxis in this population. The research hypothesis for this study would be that there likely exists one strategy that can be associated with fewer breakthrough and limited toxicity. So that leads us to our actual question to determine the rate of breakthrough CMV DNA anemia while on valganciclovir prophylaxis. So for supporting outcomes, we have incidence rate, which I'll talk a little bit more here in a later slide, of CMV DNA anemia within 3 months after discontinuation, additional monitoring, or intensification modification of the regimen. So seeing how you have your problem, your hypothesis, your question, and then supporting outcomes to coincide with your question. So you may think, okay, step by step, I have my proposal, I'm going to collect my data, and then I'm going to think about analysis, and then I'm going to think about how I'm going to put it in a paper. But I want you to consider about the paper first. Think about how you're going to present your primary outcome, whether that be a figure or a table. And you may go, that's not the right steps, but I may convince you otherwise throughout here. So we go back to that valsite question to determine the rate of breakthrough CMV DNA anemia while on valganciclovir. So you have 3 different dosing regimens, for example. Let's say you have someone dosing it twice a week, someone or another institution dosing it 3 times a week, and then now another institution's dosing it every other day. So you may think, okay, well, for my paper, my primary outcome, I'm going to have a figure, I'm going to have a bar chart here, I'm going to have percents, and then the time after transplant and the incidence of breakthrough CMV throughout. So you may think initially that it's going to look something like the figure on the left. However, this isn't going to take into account that there's variability in the duration of valganciclovir timeframe in this population. So you think about a liver transplant patient, they may be off prophylaxis by 3-6 months, whereas a lung transplant patient is still going to be on prophylaxis 3-6 months after transplant. So you're not capturing that in this graph either. The other thing is, what about censoring events? So being lost to follow-up, death. Those things aren't being accounted for either in this graph, as your denominator is likely going to be the same, especially if you're putting it into like a bar chart for your figure. So for this outcome, we want to think about incidence rate instead of just plain incidence. So what is that? So here on the far left, I have 8 people or 8 subjects in this study. So let's say subject 7 and 8 are the last two, make it to 1 year and then have CMV at 1 year. So here, the incident rate for event Y would be 2 people that had the incidence rate at 12 months, and all of them made it to 1 year before they had a CMV outcome. So then you have 2 divided by 8, and that gets you 0.25. So that's your incident rate there. Now, let's say 2 people have CMV at 6 months. So now you have still 8 subjects, but only 6 subjects have made it to 1 year without an incidence of CMV. And you have now 2 subjects that only made it half a year. So here you have 6 plus 2 halves. So you actually have 2 divided by 7, and that's 0.28 for your incidence rate. So when you do incidence rate, you're actually accounting for the duration of valsite for the patients and making sure that you're including the time denominator as well throughout your analysis. So how would this look for your publication, your figure? So here we have figure 1A, which is freedom from CMV while on valsite prophylaxis. So you definitely would want to create this so that you can account for competing risks as well. So what is a competing risk? These are events that can prevent occurrence of a primary event of interest or alter its outcome. So here we have death, loss to follow-up. You could even argue maybe rejection because it increases your immunosuppression. So this figure accounts for those competing risks, as in the denominator is the actual number of days at risk for CMV while on the prophylaxis. So many times incidence rate may be more of an appropriate statistical analysis than incidence, as it will account for the variability in duration on prophylaxis. So this is one benefit of thinking about how you're going to present the data and how maybe you need to go back to your study design and think or analysis and how maybe to reframe that. When looking at the figure 2, then you can maybe think about what baseline characteristics would be helpful to evaluate the differences between these 2 groups. Also, what supporting outcomes would be helpful. So incidence of CMV infection, maybe at 1 year, discontinuation for toxicity, and other competing risks that you would think would be helpful to add to support or to counter the figure you've created. So now that we've discussed how we're going to analyze the data and thinking about our data points, we also want to pick a way to compile that data. So the 2 biggest ones to use are Excel or REDCap. So Excel may be helpful, especially if you're getting a lot of data pulled and you're just having to add a bit of data to that. However, you do need to format everything. There's more risk for transcription errors, so it's important to put equations and markers there to kind of help assist in making sure you don't have errors when people are inserting data into the Excel sheet. And then also, how are you going to identify and handle missing data? For REDCap, as you can see here, there's a lot of bullets, so there's a lot of benefits with it as well. There's user-friendly interface allowing the creation and validation of data collection forms. Researchers can set validation rules to enforce data integrity, such as putting in particular ranges that are acceptable for the data. It also can create and make sure that you have date and time appropriately, and you have numerical or text data. So you already have that configured within the REDCap. Whereas in Excel, you may have to change your column to make sure they're all numerical values or text, especially if you're getting that data pulled. For HIPAA compliance, it's a way to securely store your data. And it's also good if you're using it for multi-center study, as it has privacy and security built in, so you can share and support logins through inter and intra-institution. You have real-time assessment of the number of cases of the charts entered, allowing user-specific permissions as well. And one good benefit is when you pull it, you can pick the format for statistical analysis depending on the software you're using. And it should be free of charge for nonprofit institutions and academic centers. Other considerations, so when creating variables within REDCap, using field test areas to add additional information. So the time frame that lab values could be collected, also branching logic helps with efficiency and avoiding free text. When organizing data in this way, you want to consider adding variables on how you're going to collect them. So having those aligned so you're not jumping around back and forth to different parts of the EHR to make sure your data form is also in line with where you're grabbing that data from in the EHR. One of the first forms is usually the inclusion and exclusion criteria to screen out patients that do not meet your study. If working on a similar project and you already use REDCap, let's say to collect CMV data, you can also use that and upload it into your new project so you don't have to recreate it. And also use databases whenever possible to help minimize the amount of manual data collection. Data dictionaries are helpful. So once you've completed your data, ideas of like your outcomes, your primary and secondary outcomes, then you have a list of what the data you are collecting for, putting that in a table form and highlighting whether it's categorical, continuous, and then also any definitions associated with it or where you're going to get it from the MAR is helpful. So definitions are great. You want to define what is baseline. You also want to put a time frame for lab values. So if you're collecting something at 3 months, 6 months, you want to add plus or minus 2 weeks or plus or minus 1 week to capture a time frame around that particular data point. How are you going to handle tacrolimus trough concentrations when they end up being less than 2? So you may want to change it to 0 and make it into a numerical form rather than a text so that you can then analyze that data more appropriately. Also, you want to think about censoring events, loss to follow-up, death, even if it's in a shorter time frame that you're looking for your study. You also want to code your data while you're collecting it so you don't have to go back to do that later. So thinking about what statistical software you're going to use for your stats and making sure that matches how you code your data. And for your primary outcome, you want to make sure all your patients have a value. So if they aren't having a value for your primary outcome, then I would reconsider your inclusion-exclusion criteria. So especially for your primary outcome, everybody included in the study should be accounted for that, and they should have a value. For data validation, data collection phase here. So again, the data dictionary for the MAR location of where you're grabbing the data and built-in quality controls is helpful. Also, one important thing is maybe having 2 different independent researchers collect 3 to 5 patients and then discuss if they had any questions or points of difference. And so there you have decision-making being done ahead of time before you've already collected on a large group of patients. You also want to make sure you standardize the number of digits you have and also when you report that out into publication. For data analysis, for continuous data, you want to make sure you've analyzed the min and max and also, again, chase down any values that don't look right. So whether negative numbers or those that come over with a greater than or less than value. And then for data reporting, it is important to report the denominator, especially for secondary outcomes. If you're having a less number than your primary outcome, because people have been lost to follow-up or have missing data, you do want to report the denominator to show the change in overall number of subjects in your 2 groups or groups. And again, be consistent with the number of digits used throughout your study. So in summary, there are some pearls to think about. So working backwards may be helpful in thinking about your study design and how you're going to actually demonstrate your outcome, whether that be in a table, figure, or written form. Also, follow flow sheet mechanics up front, making sure you define everything and really maybe testing out a few patients to make sure you don't have any further questions that come up that you need to address before gathering tons of data. Pitfalls are free text, so they're hard and time consuming to go through and analyze in particular. And then also highlighting rows to indicate abnormality. So this may be helpful for you, but if it's passed on to others, it may be very confusing and unsure of what those mean, or maybe they get mixed up over time. Collecting each group in a different spreadsheet, that may seem like a good idea at first, but then when you go to analyze, you probably want that all in one column and formatting all the same way to start with. And so now I'll move it over to Matt.
All right, we're going to take a bit of a left turn here. So now I'm going to spend the concluding moments of this webinar talking a little bit about survey-based research. And I wanted to thank both AST Transplant Pharmacy COP and then the ACCP TRaIN for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about surveys. And then to also thank all the folks that helped write this portion of the toolkit. And I have an objective. Hopefully I achieve it. But survey-based research methodology can be used to answer, otherwise unanswerable research questions. And it's really good for non-observable data. So like attitudes, beliefs, or opinions. And it can also be used to look for behaviors and actions that may be hard to measure. And so in the past, working with around burnout and the transplant pharmacy population, those kind of hard things to measure. And that's something we achieved through research-based or survey-based research platform. And we created the toolkit to help you all design, administer, analyze, and report survey-based research. And we largely focused on online platforms. And you can call people. They may not answer. You can have them fill out paperwork and hopefully fill out your survey while they're like in a waiting room, but they may not turn that in. And so a lot of people have moved to online platforms, and I've listed a couple of them here, including Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, Qualtrics, RedCap, and SurveyMonkey. And just a word of caution, if you are using these, you need to think about how accessible they are to people at different institutions. And I've run into the fact that Google Forms and Google are locked down at a lot of institutions, so that may not be the best online platform to use, depending on your sample population. And so for the design and approach, 12 easy steps. I'm only going to go through 5, but all of these are in the toolkit. But broadly, we want to define our research question. Next, determine our sample, obtaining IRB approval, choosing your instrument, then designing the questionnaire, going through the different types of questions. I'm going to spend a little bit of time about best practices for question writing, and then the number of responses based on question type, beta testing, response rates, security, and finally reporting. And the first is your sample or your target population. And so what we worry about is something called coverage area. And so if your sample differs from your target population. And so in our previous work around burnout, we wanted to know what was the prevalence of burnout in transplant pharmacists. And we sent it out on listservs that contained non-pharmacists and students. And so it would really skew our results if every single student filled out that survey, for example. And so that would be a good example of a coverage error. And a way you can overcome that is to try to randomize your sampling of the group, but we used a listserv, which is a convenient sample. So we added a question that said, are you a student? Other things is the generalizability. So is your survey really representative of the group as a whole? And as we are using a listserv, everybody on that listserv paid their dues to ACCP or ASD. And so, they may not be entirely generalizable to the entire solid organ transplant pharmacy population that's out there. And then another caveat is if you are using listservs, you have to get people's approval. And so we ask that if you'd like it to go out on the ACCP or the AST listservs, you have to send it to them for their approval prior to dissemination on those listservs. Another thing that's very important to spend some time in is your instrument. And so for this, you want to go back to the literature and see what has been done in the past. And so, going back to that burnout, originally burnout was described in inpatient hospital pharmacist. And they used some validated instruments, including the Maslach burnout inventory. And then it was later further looked at into critical care, but not transplant. And so we decided, hey, this would be a good instrument because it's been validated, at least in pharmacists, assessing burnout. Other things that we used in the past is other instruments for the well-being index. I talked about the Maslach burnout inventory, and then the interpersonal conflict at work scale is something that we've also used in the past. So ideally, you find an instrument that's been validated in your study population. That's not always the case, but in an ideal situation, this was the approach that you should take. And then comes the design. Most often, this is going to be distributed in an email. And then they'll click on a link and it'll bring you to your online survey platform. And in there, you'll have your introduction. Why are you doing this? What are you going to do with this? You will also have any IRB language. And this, like Marissa said, will most often be exempt. But if it is something that is a sensitive topic, or it may pose a risk to participants, the IRB may want to get a little bit more involved. And if so, you need to disclose this here in your survey. And then also let folks know or respondents know that if they're uncomfortable answering any of the questions, skip them. That's perfectly acceptable. And depending on the topic, you may also want to provide resources and or a hotline. So, thinking about if you're asking questions around suicide, you want to give them resources within the survey to link them to suicide awareness and prevention. Other things, if it's anonymous versus non-anonymous, if there are incentives, hey, I'm going to give you a gift card, or I'm going to put you in a raffle for an opportunity to win a gift card, you kind of putting that out there to entice people to complete your survey. Other things, question order. And I know this is going to go against everything you probably think about. Do demographics last? I know that hurts our brains to think that, but you want to have your most important research questions first. Because the likelihood that people don't complete your survey can be pretty high, especially if your survey is very long. And so anything that does not impact your study endpoints, put it at the end. Or if it's something that is very sensitive that they may not want to answer, put that at the end. And then also kind of a global perspective, ask very general questions and then drill down to something more specific. And I'll talk about that into some of the, when we talk about questions. Branching and display logic is also something that's important. So earlier I talked about we wanted to make assess transplant pharmacists and burnout, not students. So the first question was, are you a student? And if it said yes, it brought you to the end of the survey and said, thank you very much. So that way it can increase survey efficiency and workflow. Other things, formatting, something that is extremely important is how does it look on a phone? Most of us are on our phones a lot. And if the survey is easier to complete on a phone-based format, it's a little bit more user-friendly. And then a little bit on question types, positively worded questions are better than negatively worded questions. Closed-ended are better to analyze than open-ended, things like that. For question writing, complex language, we like to make things more difficult than they need to be. And so, for example, what is the goal length of stay according to the receipt of induction, immunosuppression, insurance authorization, and placement for an index kidney transplant at your center? I don't know what that's even asking. So what is the goal length of stay for an index kidney transplant at your center? I know what that means. Avoid vague terms. Everybody may not know what slow graft function is. And then double negatives. What was the number of transplant recipients who were not inappropriately dosed for their renal function? I don't know what that means. So there's potentially better ways to ask questions. Other things, if it's double barreled. And so this is asking two questions in one. And this can often be seen because you want to limit the number of questions you ask in your survey. And so example of that is, did you assess for rejection at 6 and 12 months with a single yes, no? So that really should be two separate questions. And then any questions that may be leading. With the shortage of organ donors and patients who are dying on the wait list, do you believe high KDPI kidneys should be used more often? So we're obviously leading the respondent in how we want them to answer that question. And then to round it out, well, we worry about security. Worry about bots taking over your survey and just putting a bunch of garbage in there. Or if there's multiple submissions. And a lot of the online survey platforms can do things to prevent this, but they're not always enabled by default. And the other thing to be careful with is the use of social media. It's great to advertise, but I wouldn't link your survey on Instagram or something like that, because you're going to get people that are not your sample population filling out your survey. And the toolkit, it's got a lot of great information in it, and it's got the stuff you need to get off the ground and do survey-based research. And if you really want some more information, the references by Hill are excellent and very easy to read and to help wrap your mind around survey-based research methodology. And that I'll open it up to Dana. I think she's going to lead us with question and answers.
All right, thank you so much, Kristen, Marissa, and Matt. As Matt said, I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions for our speakers today, feel free to either unmute and ask them verbally, or you can send the message in the chat function. While people are thinking, I'm just going to kick us off with one question. So what would you guys recommend to someone who might be interested in getting involved in more multi-center research projects, but aren't really sure where to start or how to initiate those?
I'll start with that one. We have a 52-page toolkit that I think we've been talking about for 55 minutes so far. That's online on both ACCP and the AST websites. Be a member of TRaIN. It's open to all students, residents, early practitioners, old people, anybody that wants to get involved with research, please join. We have people that have been doing research for a long time, and we want to get people more involved, and we're open to new people, but I know people are scared. Join our group and you'll see who's talking, and you'll find people that are working in areas that may be of interest to you, and just reach out to somebody and let us know, hey, I'd like to be more involved. What are the steps I need to take? I don't know, Kristen, Marissa, what do you guys think?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Kristen. Go ahead. No, I agree fully with I can't even talk with what Matt said. I'm not a research guru or expert by any means. I mean, I tinkle in it and like just try to get a little bit involved, but I think the joint AST ACCP research committee I chose to be a part of and to work with kind of as a priority the past couple of years, just to get myself more feet in the sand with research and multi-center research. And I've definitely had numerous opportunities to do that through this committee. So I would encourage any students, residents, new practitioners, seasoned practitioners to join this group. All you, Kristen.
I was just going to add to, if you're thinking of starting a multi-center project, but you're a little bit overwhelmed, I would maybe start small. Grab a colleague at one other center, two other centers, and you all are doing it together and learning together at the same time. And maybe you all are okay. You don't have like a grand deadline of like 1 year, we're going to complete this. Maybe you guys are okay completing at 2 years. I would still set deadlines so people stay on task and get things done, but you can always start small and learn how to navigate your IRB. And then maybe you're like, okay, I got it down. It wasn't as bad as I thought. It went smooth sailing. Or maybe there were hiccups, but you learned from them. And so now you're like, I'm ready to add 20 centers and like do this all over again. But if you're a little hesitant on like leading such a large multi-center project, just start with like one other center. You still have to go through collaborative agreements and data use agreements and things like that. If you're looking to join a multi-center study, I think, yeah, joining TRaIN or even learning more about multi-center studies through TRaIN is very beneficial as well, like Marissa and Matt mentioned. But if you're looking outside of that, I would just maybe start small.
Great, thanks. And then I have another question more specifically towards Matt. So you mentioned how people should be getting permission from the listservs if they want to utilize them. Is there anyone specific that they should be reaching out to? And is it the same if they are interested in going through a different PRN, such as like if they had a project specifically for liver that they wanted to go through the liver COP?
Yeah, for at least for AST, you would reach out to the chair and co-chair of each COP. I imagine it's the same for ACCP, but I know we have people on this call who lead that group. And all those are on the AST's COP's website. And then they would send it to the executive committee, seeing whether or not they approve it. And what I'd hate for you to do is to send it out and then have it taken down. So it's better to ask for permission before you just send it out there.
All right, well, I think that just about wraps us up. And I just want to thank again our speakers so much for participating in this webinar today. Really great really great talk, really informative. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the AST, TX Farm COP, and the ACCP Transplant PRN for allowing us to have this webinar today. And just for everyone who's on the call, try to save the date for August 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be the next joint webinar. It's going to be an Ask Me Anything webinar on mentoring tips and tricks. And there was an email sent out a few days ago about registering for that upcoming webinar. It should be a good one. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you to our speakers again.